Four-Sided Fantasy is a platformer with some pretty interesting mechanics involving screen wrapping and some other stuff, but I don't want to go too far into that here. The main thing I want to talk about is how Four-Sided Fantasy uses the foreground. And the foreground is an area that very few games actually take advantage of. Games with a fixed camera, anyway. If you put something in the foreground in a two-dimensional game, it completely blocks that section of the screen, so you have to be careful with it. So as a result, developers generally put anything decorative in the background and anything that interacts with the game mechanically in the midground where the player is. But Four-Sided Fantasy uses its pretty simplistic foreground for a couple different purposes, all of which take advantage of the fact that the foreground covers the area the player can see. First of all, it uses the foreground for something called dynamic loading. Most loading screens happen between levels, or sometimes even in the middle of a level, to load the next section of the game. I don't think most people would deny that loading screens are pretty boring. Usually that loading screen means the player does nothing until it's done loading. The problem is that in order to load one area, the game often has to unload the area the player is currently in. The game is swapping out stored data, as it can only hold so much at a time. This is why games can't just load everything at once at the beginning. Games need a transition area of some sort while the data is being swapped out. So games essentially need the two stages and then a third area in the middle of them, which is usually in the form of a loading screen. But another option for this transition area is to pretend the loading screen doesn't even exist by basically distracting the player. This is generally the best option if the game can allow for it. This is what dynamic loading is. The game is hiding the loading screens from the player. Between every single level, Four-Sided Fantasy uses the foreground to completely cover the screen before unveiling the next level. But as long as you keep walking forwards, the screen is always moving, even if it takes a few seconds to get from one level to the next. This makes it feel like it doesn't need to load anything at all, which makes the gameplay feel that much smoother. People want to be distracted while they're waiting, and something that covers the entire screen is pretty distracting. As I said earlier, the game uses the fact that the foreground hides the screen to its advantage, rather than trying to resist it. The foreground doesn't just hide loading between levels, it also creates interesting transitions between levels. It's always a balance in games like this one between dividing the game up into stages while also making it as seamless as possible if you're just playing it through. With a foreground shift between levels, it makes the game more streamlined. It doesn't feel like it's segmented into little sections in the same way that just a background change would. Something else the foreground does well is create interesting shifts in perspective and setting without it looking like a jump cut. It can zoom the camera way out or move you from a sunny field to a gloomy forest, but it's not jarring, at least not in a bad way. Because you don't actually see the transition happen, it's a lot more organic. It feels like you traveled to a different setting rather than a different level, which is good because it makes the game feel more cohesive. And that's exactly what this game uses the foreground to do, making the game feel more alive. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching this episode of Breakdown.